Burbank, California, February 1st, 1973. NBC Studios, Stage 1. The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson. At exactly 11:30 p.m., 30 million Americans tuned in to watch the most powerful man in television do what he did best: make legends sweat under the studio lights. But tonight was different. Tonight, Johnny Carson had a guest who didn't sweat for anyone. A guest who had sold more records than any human being alive. A guest the whole world simply called the King. Elvis Presley walked through that famous rainbow curtain, and the 400 people in that studio audience erupted like nothing Carson had ever heard. Women screamed. Men stood and applauded. Ed McMahon's introduction was drowned out completely. Carson smiled his famous smile and shook Elvis's hand. Two kings, one stage, 30 million witnesses. Carson had a plan. He had spent 3 days preparing one single question, one challenge, one dare that would either expose Elvis as just another pretty face with a microphone, or reveal something the world had never seen. In the corner of that stage sat a grand piano, black, polished, silent. It had been there for 11 years, mostly for decoration. Guests occasionally glanced at it. Nobody ever played it. Tonight, that piano would change everything. Because within the next few minutes, something was going to happen on live television that would make Johnny Carson, the man famous for never losing control, break down in tears in front of the entire nation. And it all started with 5 simple words Carson was about to say. If you've ever doubted someone and then watched them prove you completely wrong, you already know what's coming. But trust me, you're not ready for how it happened. Where are you watching from tonight? Drop your location in the comments. To understand what happened that night, you need to understand both men. Johnny Carson wasn't just a talk show host. He was the gatekeeper of American fame. One appearance on his couch could launch a career. One raised eyebrow could destroy one. He had interviewed presidents, movie stars, and legends. He had seen everything. Surprised him? Nearly impossible. But Elvis made him nervous. Not because of the fame. Carson had handled fame before. What made him nervous was the question he couldn't answer. Was Elvis Presley actually talented, or just the most successful act in entertainment history? Carson had watched Elvis shake his hips on Ed Sullivan. He had seen the movies, heard the screaming fans. But he had never seen proof that Elvis was more than just a product. More than just a handsome face the Colonel had packaged and sold to teenage girls. And Carson wanted to know the truth. What Carson didn't know was that Elvis was fighting the same battle inside himself. By 1973, Elvis was trapped. Trapped in Vegas. Trapped in jumpsuits. Trapped in a version of himself that the world expected, but his soul rejected. Every night, he performed the same songs for crowds who wanted the young Elvis, the hip-shaking rebel. But that man was gone. The real Elvis, the one nobody saw, sat alone at his piano in Graceland at 3 a.m, playing the gospel songs his mama taught him before she died. That Elvis wept while he played. That Elvis missed his mother so deeply it physically hurt. Gladys Presley had died in 1958. 15 years later, Elvis still couldn't talk about her without his voice breaking. She was the one who first put his fingers on piano keys. She was the one who sang hymns to him in their tiny shotgun house in Tupelo, Mississippi. She was the one who believed he was special when the whole world said he was nothing. And when she died, a part of Elvis died with her. That night in Burbank, Elvis carried her memory in his chest like a stone. He didn't know Carson was about to reach in and pull it out for 30 million people to witness. The interview started smoothly, but the piece wouldn't last long. For the first 10 minutes, everything went exactly as expected. Elvis charmed. Carson joked. The audience laughed at all the right moments. They talked about Vegas, about movies, about the famous jumpsuits. Then Carson leaned back in his chair. His eyes narrowed slightly. The look his staff knew meant trouble was coming. "Elvis," Carson said, tapping his pencil against the desk, "I've been doing this show for 11 years. I've had musicians, composers, classical pianists. But there's always been a rumor about you that I've never been able to confirm." Elvis raised an eyebrow. "What's that, Johnny?" "They say you actually play piano. Not just hunt and peck. Really play." Carson paused. "Is that true? Or is that just your publicity people trying to make you look more talented than you are?" The audience laughed nervously. Elvis smiled, but something flickered behind his eyes. "Oh, I just mess around, Johnny. Nothing serious." Carson nodded slowly. Then he pointed across the stage at the grand piano sitting silent in the corner. "That piano has been on this stage since 1962. 11 years. You know how many people have actually played it?" Carson held up his hand, showing 0 fingers. "Nobody. Not once." He turned back to Elvis. "So here's my dare, Elvis. Right now, live television, 30 million people watching." Carson's voice dropped lower. "Show me something real. Play that piano. Prove to me, prove to all of us, that you're not just a product." The studio went silent. Elvis looked at the piano, then at Carson, then at the piano again. In his mind, he heard Colonel Parker's voice screaming at him from backstage. "Stick to the script. Give them what they want. Don't take risks." But beneath that voice was another one, softer, warmer. A voice that had been gone for 15 years, but never really left. His mama's voice. "Baby," she used to say, "God gave you that gift. Don't you ever hide it." Elvis stood up from the couch. The audience gasped. Nobody moved. Even Carson seemed surprised it had actually worked. Elvis walked across that stage toward the piano, and with every step, 30 million Americans watched him transform. He wasn't walking like Elvis the King. He wasn't walking like Elvis the Star. He was walking like Elvis Aaron Presley, the poor boy from Tupelo who learned to play piano in a one-room church before he could read. And Johnny Carson had no idea what he had just unleashed. If you're feeling this story in your heart right now, hit that subscribe button. Where in the world are you watching from? Elvis sat down at the piano. The leather bench creaked beneath him. His rings caught the studio lights. His fingers hovered over the keys. The same keys that had been silent for 11 years, waiting. For a moment, nothing happened. Carson watched from his desk. The audience held their breath. 30 million Americans leaned closer to their television screens. Then Elvis pressed down. One chord, deep, rich, gospel. It echoed through that studio like a church bell through an empty valley. The sound was so unexpected, so pure, that Carson physically leaned back in his chair. This wasn't rock and roll. This wasn't Vegas. This was something sacred. Elvis closed his eyes and began to play. The song was an old hymn, Peace in the Valley, the same song his mama used to sing while she cooked dinner in their tiny kitchen, the same song she requested at her own funeral, the same song Elvis hadn't been able to perform in public since the day he buried her. And then he began to sing. The voice that came out wasn't the voice America knew. It wasn't smooth. It wasn't polished. It cracked. It trembled. It broke on the high notes and wavered on the low ones. It was the most beautiful thing anyone in that studio had ever heard, because it was real. In the front row, a woman in pearls stopped breathing. Tears rolled down her face without her even noticing. 3 rows back, a man who had won 2 Purple Hearts in Vietnam lowered his head and wept silently. Near the back, a teenage girl who had come to scream for her idol instead sat frozen, her hand covering her mouth. The NBC orchestra, Doc Severinsen and the Tonight Show band had been ready to accompany Elvis if needed. Instead, every single musician set down their instruments. Doc Severinsen lowered his trumpet and simply listened. No one had ever heard anything like this. Elvis wasn't in Burbank anymore. He was back in Memphis, back in 1958, back in his mama's hospital room, holding her hand while she slipped away from him forever. He was playing for her, singing to her, telling her everything he never got to say. The song built. Elvis's voice grew stronger through the pain. The piano swelled beneath his fingers, like it had been waiting its whole existence for this exact moment. And then, the final note. Silence. 3 seconds of complete, absolute silence. Then Carson did something no one had ever seen him do in 11 years of broadcasting. He wiped his eyes. Johnny Carson, the king of composure, the master of the witty comeback, the man who had interviewed every powerful person in America without flinching, sat at his desk with tears streaming down his face. He tried to speak. His voice broke. He cleared his throat. Elvis. Carson's voice was barely a whisper. I've had presidents on this couch. I've had kings and queens and movie legends. But I have never. He stopped, shook his head, pressed his hand to his chest. I have never witnessed anything like that in my entire life. The audience erupted. Standing ovation. 400 people on their feet, tears on their faces, applauding something they knew they would never forget. Elvis sat at the piano, his head bowed, his shoulders shaking. He wasn't crying because of the applause. He was crying because for the first time in 15 years, he felt his mama's presence again. The commercial break came, but nobody moved. Carson stayed at his desk, still composing himself. Elvis remained at the piano, his hands flat against the keys, as if afraid to let go. The audience sat in stunned silence, unwilling to break the spell. Off camera, Carson leaned toward Elvis and said something no microphone picked up. Whatever it was, Elvis nodded slowly, his eyes still wet. Backstage, chaos erupted. NBC switchboard lit up like a Christmas tree. Thousands of calls flooded in within minutes. Operators couldn't keep up. Every single caller asked the same thing. What just happened? Who was that? Was that really Elvis Presley? Colonel Tom Parker, Elvis's legendary manager, stood in the wings with his face the color of a ripe tomato. This wasn't part of the plan. This wasn't the act. This wasn't sellable. But for the first time in years, Elvis didn't care what the colonel thought. When the cameras came back on, Carson looked directly into the lens and spoke to America. I owe Elvis an apology, Carson said, his voice still thick with emotion. I asked him to prove he was more than what we thought. I expected him to fail. Instead, he just taught all of us something about honesty, about pain, and about the courage it takes to show the world who you really are. He turned to Elvis. I've never said this to a guest before. I'm honored you trusted us with that. Elvis simply nodded. My mama always said the truth sounds different than a performance. He paused. I think she was right. The next morning, every newspaper in America ran the story. Elvis makes Carson cry, screamed the headlines. The king reveals his soul on live TV. Critics who had dismissed Elvis as a nostalgia act suddenly wrote think pieces about his artistry. Record executives called Sun Records asking about gospel albums. But none of that mattered to Elvis. What mattered was what happened when he got back to Graceland that night. Alone in his piano room, surrounded by photos of his mama, Elvis sat down and played Peace in the Valley one more time. This time, he smiled. Because he finally understood something Gladys had been trying to tell him for 15 years. The world didn't love him for the costumes, the hip shakes, or the Vegas lights. The world loved him because somewhere inside all that performance was a real human being with a real heart. He just had to be brave enough to show it. And on that February night, Johnny Carson had dared him to do exactly that. If this story is hitting different for you right now, you're not alone. Hit subscribe and tell me, Where in the world are you watching this? For the rest of his career, Johnny Carson called that night the single greatest moment in Tonight Show history. In interviews years later, he returned to it again and again. "I've asked thousands of questions over 3 decades," Carson said after his retirement. "I've only received one answer that actually changed me, and it came from Elvis Presley, sitting at a piano he had no business playing that well." Elvis changed too. After that night, he insisted on including more gospel music in his concerts. He won 3 Grammy Awards, all 3 for gospel recordings. He told interviewers it was the only music that made him feel close to his roots, close to his mama. The kinescope of that Tonight Show performance became legendary. NBC received more requests for that clip than almost any other moment in the show's history. Decades later, it still circulates among Elvis fans as proof of something they always believed, that behind the jumpsuits and the screaming fans was a man of deep faith and even deeper pain. Elvis passed away in 1977, just 4 years after that night in Burbank. Carson was one of the first to offer a public tribute. "Elvis showed me something about courage that I've never forgotten," Carson told his audience the night Elvis died. "He taught me that the moments we try hardest to hide are often the moments that matter most." The piano on stage 1 remained there for years after. Occasionally, guests would glance at it, ask about it. Someone from production would always tell the same story. "Elvis Presley played that piano once, made Johnny Carson cry. Nobody's touched it since, and nobody ever did. Because some moments are too sacred to repeat." That piano sat silent for 11 years before Elvis touched it. 11 years of waiting for someone brave enough to play something true. It only took one man, one dare, one song, and 30 million people watched the most famous entertainer in the world break down every wall he had ever built. Not with his fame, not with his talent, but with his honesty. Johnny Carson dared Elvis to prove he was real. Elvis answered by playing the song his dying mother loved most. That's not performance. That's courage. So here's the question for you tonight. What's your piano? What's the thing you've been hiding because you're afraid people will judge you? What's the truth you've been too scared to show the world? Maybe it's a talent you've buried. Maybe it's a story you've never told. Maybe it's a part of yourself you think nobody will understand. Remember Elvis walking to that piano. Remember that he wasn't walking as a star. He was walking as a son who missed his mama. And that honesty, that raw, unfiltered truth, is what brought Johnny Carson to tears. Some dares are too important to refuse. Some songs are too sacred to keep silent. Some truths are too powerful to hide forever. Elvis Presley knew this. Johnny Carson witnessed it. And on that unforgettable February night in 1973, 30 million Americans learned something they would never forget. The performance lasted 4 minutes. The tears lasted a lifetime. The legend will last forever. Thank you for watching until the end. Where in the world are you joining me from? Drop your country in the comments, and if this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it today.